For 10 seconds, forget the maps. Forget the arrows and flags and neat little timelines in history books. Imagine instead the sound of breathing in the dark. Heavy, slow, exhausted. The kind of breathing that comes from lungs that have been walking for weeks through rain, mud, and heat that never leaves your skin. Somewhere in the jungle of Burma, in 1943, a man sits on a fallen tree and tries to remember what dry clothes feel like. He cannot. His boots are soaked. His rifle is rusting at the edges. His stomach is empty in a way that no meal can fix quickly. And above him, the jungle does not care who he is or which side he is on. This is a war most people never picture. No beaches, no triumphant parades, no clean victories. Just green walls of forest, winding rivers, and a long, quiet fight against distance, disease, and the simple problem of getting food to people who are slowly disappearing into the hills. The campaign in Burma, which today we call Myanmar, began not as a grand plan, but as a consequence. In December 1941, Japan expanded its war across Southeast Asia with stunning speed. Hong Kong fell. Malaya collapsed. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942. Burma lay in between British India and China. It was not famous. It was not glamorous. But it mattered because a single road ran through it, the Burma Road. That road was China's lifeline. After Japan invaded China in 1937, much of China's coastline was cut off. Supplies from the outside world had only one practical route: ships to Rangoon, then trucks north through the jungle, across mountains, and into Yunnan province. Every rifle, every medical kit, every barrel of fuel that reached Chinese forces came through that narrow, fragile artery. When Japan moved into Burma in early 1942, it was not just taking land. It was closing a door. In 1942, American General Claire Lee Chennault, who commanded the U.S. Army Air Forces in China, argued that supplies could be flown over the eastern end of the Himalayas. This route became known simply as the Hump. The name sounded casual. The reality was not. Pilots flew old transport aircraft over some of the highest mountains in the world, often without accurate weather reports or reliable navigation aids. Icing, turbulence, and sudden storms were common. Engines failed in thin air. Planes vanished into clouds and were never found. According to official U.S. Army Air Forces records, hundreds of aircraft were lost on the route between India and China. Thousands of crewmen died. But month by month, ton by ton, supplies began to move again. On the ground, a different kind of war took shape. In 1943, British General William Slim took command of the 14th Army. His force was a mix of British, Indian, and African divisions, many of which had already experienced defeat and retreat. Slim believed that before they could fight the Japanese, they had to survive the jungle. He focused on food, medical care, and training. Malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus were killing more men than bullets. Slim insisted on strict discipline about taking anti-malarial drugs, using mosquito nets, and boiling water. These were not heroic measures. They did not make good headlines, but over time, sickness rates dropped. In his memoir, Defeat into Victory, Slim wrote that morale in Burma depended on something simple. The soldier must feel that his commander cares for him, that he will not be thrown away. This idea shaped how the campaign was fought. Instead of long, vulnerable supply lines that could be cut by Japanese infiltration, Allied units began to operate from fortified boxes that could be supplied by air. If surrounded, they did not retreat. They held position and waited for planes to drop food, ammunition, and medicine. The British and Indian forces in Burma were not prepared for what came. Many units were trained for desert or temperate climates, not for rainforest warfare. Equipment designed for Europe failed in the humidity. Radios shorted out. Boots rotted. Maps were often outdated or simply wrong. In March and April of 1942, Japanese divisions pushed north with speed that shocked their opponents. Rangoon fell. Allied forces retreated toward India in what survivors would later describe as a long, confused march through heat, hunger, and rain that never seemed to stop. Historian Raymond Callahan, writing in The Worst Disaster, The fall of Singapore described the broader Allied collapse in Southeast Asia as a failure of preparation and imagination. Burma was part of that same pattern. The theater was underestimated. The enemy was misunderstood, and the terrain was treated like a background detail instead of the main character in the story. By mid-1942, Japan controlled most of Burma. The Burma Road was cut. China was more isolated than ever. For the Allies, this created a problem that could not be solved with a single battle. They needed a way back in. What followed was not a traditional campaign of sweeping offensives and dramatic breakthroughs. It was a slow construction of systems, roads, air routes, supply chains, medical networks. It was a war where victory depended less on how many enemy soldiers you could defeat and more on how many of your own you could keep alive. In the jungles and hills along the India-Burma border, British, Indian, African, Chinese, and later American forces began to rebuild from almost nothing. Bases were carved out of forest. Airstrips were flattened by hand. Engineers worked in mud up to their knees, laying down steel mesh and gravel so transport planes could land. One of the most unusual responses to the loss of the Burma Road came from the sky. This method was tested in early 1944 at a place called Imphal, near the Indian border. Japanese forces launched a major offensive, aiming to push into India and shake British control. They advanced quickly, cutting roads and isolating Allied positions. By conventional standards, the defenders should not have survived. But the air supply system held. Transport planes flew day and night, dropping supplies into small clearings and rough airstrips. Wounded soldiers were carried out by air. Fresh troops were brought in. The surrounded units endured. Japanese forces, stretched far from their own supply bases, began to run short of food. Historian Lewis Allen later described Imphal and the nearby Battle of Kohima as a turning point in the Burma campaign. For the first time, a major Japanese ground offensive had been halted in the jungle. Even in success, the cost remained steady and unseen. Men did not only fall in combat, they succumbed to fever in bamboo shelters. Minor wounds became serious without proper care. Others collapsed on mountain paths, carrying loads their weakened bodies could barely manage. The war in Burma left no single image the world remembers. There was no moment like the flag on Iwo Jima, no parade through a freed capital to define the campaign in memory. Instead, its traces remain in letters, diaries, and regimental records. A British medic in 1944 wrote of treating soldiers under a poncho during the monsoon, trying to keep rain from open wounds. An Indian infantryman recalled weeks of rice with salt and chilies, dreaming of bread. An American pilot described flying over endless green ridges, knowing that an engine failure meant only forest below. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Allies began pushing back into central Burma. This time, they brought their systems with them. Roads were built behind advancing troops. Pontoon bridges crossed rivers that had once been natural barriers. Airfields appeared in places that had been empty jungle months before. The campaign became, in many ways, a moving network. Steel met dirt. Fuel met engines. Food met hands that were finally steady enough to hold it. When Mandalay fell in March 1945 and Rangoon was retaken in May, the war in Burma was effectively over. But it did not end with a single, clear moment of celebration. The soldiers who had fought there often felt that their war had happened somewhere off to the side of history. Europe had its liberation. The Pacific had its island battles. Burma had its rain, its roads, and its long lines of men walking forward with packs on their backs, trying not to fall behind. Today, historians like Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper, in Forgotten Armies, argue that the Burma campaign was one of the most complex and multinational efforts of the Second World War. British, Indian, African, Chinese, American, and local Burmese forces all played roles in a conflict shaped as much by geography and logistics as by strategy. But complexity does not always become memory. What remains, for many, is a quieter legacy. A war where victory came not from a single bold stroke, but from thousands of small, stubborn acts. A pilot choosing to fly one more trip over the mountains. An engineer laying one more stretch of road. A medic boiling water for one more patient. Not heroes and statues. Just people, trying to keep each other alive in a place that did not want them there. Some wars are drawn with thick lines on maps. Arrows sweeping forward. Fronts moving like curtains across a stage. Burma refused to be drawn that way. The jungle broke every straight line into 100 crooked paths. Rivers curved. Hills rose without warning. Villages appeared and vanished behind walls of green. And in that maze, a new kind of fighting began to take shape, one that did not rely on holding ground, but on moving through it without being seen. In 1943, a British officer named Ordie Wingate believed that the jungle itself could be turned into a weapon. Wingate had already made a name for himself in the Middle East, leading irregular forces behind enemy lines. In Burma, he proposed something more ambitious. Long-range penetration groups that would march deep into Japanese-held territory, cut railways, attack supply dumps, and then disappear back into the forest. These units became known as the Chindits, named after a mythical lion-like creature from Burmese folklore. Their mission was not to win battles in the traditional sense. It was to stretch the Japanese system until it began to tear. In February 1943, the first Chindit expedition crossed the Chindwin River and moved into central Burma. Nearly 3,000 men walked into territory where no large Allied force had operated since the retreat of 1942. They carried everything on their backs: food, ammunition, radios, medical supplies. Mules carried some loads, but most of the weight fell on human shoulders. The jungle did not care about their plans. Heat drained energy in hours. Leeches clung to legs and boots. Rivers flooded without warning. Radios failed. Men became separated in the undergrowth and sometimes never found their units again. Historian Frank McLynn later wrote that the Chindits' greatest enemy was not the Japanese, but exhaustion itself. Men marched until their feet split. They slept in rain-soaked clothes. They ate rations that were never meant to last as long as the mission demanded. And yet, they reached their targets. Rail lines were blown up. Bridges were destroyed. Japanese units were forced to divert troops and supplies to chase shadows through the forest. The Chindits did not hold territory. They created uncertainty. The cost was heavy. Of the original force, only about 2/3 made it back to Allied lines. Many who returned were skeletal, sick with malaria or dysentery, and permanently weakened. Wingate defended the operation as a success, arguing that the disruption caused was worth the losses. Others, even at the time, were not so sure. But the idea of deep jungle operations did not fade. It grew. By 1944, long-range penetration became part of a much larger plan. This time, the jungle would not just hide small units. It would host entire air supply bases behind enemy lines. Under the command of American General Joseph Stilwell and British leadership, Allied forces worked with Chinese divisions trained and equipped in India. Their goal was to reopen a land route into China by building a new road through northern Burma. This became the Ledo Road, later called the Stilwell Road. On paper, it was a line on a map. On the ground, it was a wound cut into the earth. Engineers blasted through hills, filled swamps, and bridged rivers that surged during the monsoon. Bulldozers sank into mud. Trucks broke axles on rough ground. Men worked with hand tools in rain that turned the soil into something closer to clay than dirt. According to U.S. Army Corps of Engineers records, the road took nearly 2 years to complete. It stretched more than 1,000 miles from northeastern India, through northern Burma, and into China. Every mile came with a cost and sweat, sickness, and lives. While the road crept forward, the air war over the hump continued. By late 1944, the tonnage flown into China had increased dramatically. New aircraft, better navigation, and improved weather forecasting reduced losses, but the route never became safe. Pilots still spoke of sudden storms that rose like walls in front of their planes, of ice forming on wings in clear skies, of looking down through breaks in cloud and seeing nothing but ridges, one after another, with no place to land. The sky was not an escape from the jungle. It was just another version of it, On the Japanese side, the war in Burma was also becoming a struggle against distance. Japan's early advances had relied on speed and aggression. But by 1944, their supply system was strained. Allied submarines and aircraft disrupted shipping across Southeast Asia. Fuel and ammunition became harder to move. Reinforcements arrived slowly, if at all. Japanese units in the field often lived off the land. When the land could not support them, hunger followed. After the failure of the Imphal offensive, entire divisions were reduced by starvation and disease. Some soldiers collapsed on the march and were left behind. Others kept moving on legs that barely worked, driven by discipline and the knowledge that stopping meant being alone in the jungle. Accounts from Japanese veterans collected after the war describe a campaign that became less about defeating the enemy and more about enduring the conditions. One officer recalled that, by late 1944, we fought the jungle as much as we fought the British. In northern Burma, Chinese and American forces began to push south. They captured airfields, which were quickly repaired, and used to bring in more supplies and aircraft. The system expanded step by step. One of the key objectives was the town of Myitkyina, home to a major airstrip. In May 1944, Allied forces launched an assault that surprised the Japanese defenders. The airfield fell quickly, but the town itself became the center of a long, grinding battle. For months, fighting went house to house. The jungle pressed in from the edges. Rain turned streets into mud. Supplies had to be flown in. Casualties had to be flown out. When Myitkyina finally fell in August, it gave the Allies a permanent base in northern Burma. From there, the link between air supply and ground advance became even tighter. The war turned into a moving equation. Airfields allowed more planes. Planes allowed more supplies. Supplies allowed more troops. More troops allowed more airfields. By late 1944, this system was rolling south. Villages that had seen no major armies for years suddenly found columns of men, trucks, and pack animals moving through. Bridges rose where ferries had once crossed. Roads cut through fields that had grown rice for generations. For the local Burmese population, the war was not a story of strategy or logistics. It was a series of disruptions. Some villages were evacuated. Others became temporary bases. Food was requisitioned. Labor was demanded. Families moved back and forth between occupied and contested areas, trying to stay out of the way of forces that spoke different languages but carried the same weapons. Historians like WWII have written about how the Burma campaign deepened the political and social fractures in the country, setting the stage for conflicts that would continue long after 1945. But in the moment, most people were focused on the next day. By early 1945, the Allied advance accelerated. The Irrawaddy River, once a major natural barrier, was crossed with a combination of deception and speed. Japanese forces were outmaneuvered and forced into retreat. Mandalay fell, then Meiktila. The road to Rangoon opened. Yet even in these final months, the war did not become simple. Japanese units continued to fight in isolated pockets. Roads were mined. Bridges were blown. Small engagements flared in villages and forest clearings far from any front line drawn on a map. The campaign ended not with a single, decisive clash, but with a series of movements that slowly closed the remaining gaps. When British forces entered Rangoon in May 1945, they found a city largely abandoned by the Japanese, taken more by planning and timing than by direct assault. The war in Burma was over. But the memory of it did not spread far. Many of the soldiers who returned home found that their stories did not fit the larger narrative people expected. There were no famous landings to describe, no clear moment when everything changed. Just long marches, rain, and the steady work of keeping a system alive. In letters and memoirs, they often returned to the same images. A plane appearing out of clouds, dropping crates into a clearing. A road finally connecting two places that had felt impossibly far apart. A meal eaten in silence, grateful simply for being warm and dry for one night. This was not a war of spectacle. It was a war of connections. And every connection, once made, changed what could happen next. By the start of 1945, the war in Burma had stopped pretending to be a single campaign. It had become a web of movements, decisions, and small, connected victories that stretched from airfields in India to river crossings in the Burmese heartland. For the men on the ground, it felt simpler than that. It felt like walking. Columns moved along roads that had not existed a year before. Trucks followed paths that had once been foot trails. Engineers stayed close behind the infantry, repairing bridges almost as soon as they were damaged. Every advance carried its own shadow, a line of supply that had to be kept alive, or the forward motion would simply stop. The Irrawaddy River was the last great natural barrier before central Burma opened wide. Japanese commanders expected the Allies to attempt a direct crossing near Mandalay, where the river narrowed and the terrain favored defense. Instead, British General William Slim ordered a deception. Visible preparations were made in the north, while the main force moved south under cover of speed and secrecy. In February 1945, Allied troops crossed the Irrawaddy near Pakoku, far from where the Japanese expected the main blow to fall. The operation relied on tight coordination between ground units, engineers, and air support. Pontoon bridges were assembled under fire. Boats shuttled men and vehicles across water that moved faster than it looked. Once across, the advance turned into a race. The key objective was Meghtala, a town that sat at the center of Burma's road and rail network. Control it, and movement across much of the country could be directed or denied. Allied forces reached Meghtala in early March and took it in a rapid assault that again relied on surprise. The Japanese counterattacked fiercely, surrounding the town and cutting the roads. For weeks, Meghtala became another air-supplied box, much like in fall a year earlier. Transport aircraft flew in ammunition and food. Wounded were flown out. Fighters and bombers struck Japanese positions around the perimeter. The town held. When Japanese forces finally withdrew, their ability to coordinate large-scale movement in central Burma collapsed with them. Mandalay fell soon after. The Japanese line of retreat began to fracture into smaller, isolated groups moving south and east, often without clear orders or reliable supply. The monsoon was coming. For every army that had fought in Burma, the seasonal rains were as decisive as any enemy formation. Roads that were passable in March became rivers of mud by May. Airstrips flooded. Rivers swelled and changed their banks. The Allies pushed to take Rangoon before the rains closed in. This final operation, codenamed Dracula, combined airborne drops, amphibious landings, and a ground advance from the north. It was planned as a complex, multi-pronged assault on a defended port. When British forces entered Rangoon on May 2, 1945, they found that Japanese troops had already withdrawn. The city was taken, not through direct assault, but through careful timing. With Rangoon secured, Burma's main supply port returned to Allied control. The long route from India, across jungle and mountains, once again reached a deep-water harbor. In military terms, the campaign had ended. But the story did not end when the guns grew quiet. For many soldiers who fought in Burma, coming home carried a sense of emptiness. Europe had its victory marches. The Pacific had island names that filled headlines. Burma had no single word to capture what it had been. Veterans spoke of heat and rain, of leeches and endless marches, of friends who went into the jungle and did not return, not in a final stand, but in a medical tent or on a stretcher beside a muddy road. In post-war histories, the Burma campaign often appeared between larger chapters. Yet for the countries and communities it touched, it was a moment of change. British colonial authority, weakened by the war, did not fully recover. Burmese nationalist movements, some once aligned with the Japanese, turned toward independence. In 1948, Burma became a sovereign state. The structures built for war, roads, airfields, and supply bases reshaped how regions connected. Some supported post-war growth. Others faded back into forest, reclaimed by the same jungle that once concealed armies. Historians, such as Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper, have noted that the campaign revealed how modern war depended as much on organization and supply as on combat. The movement of food, fuel, and medicine across difficult terrain shaped what plans could succeed. For those who lived through it, these ideas appeared in simpler forms. A road that allowed a village to be reached in a day instead of a week. An airstrip that meant a sick child could be flown to a hospital. A river crossing that connected markets on opposite banks. The war had forced these connections into existence. Peace decided which ones remained. In personal diaries preserved in archives in Britain, India, and the United States, there is a recurring theme. Many soldiers wrote that Burma changed how they thought about distance. A few miles in the jungle could take a day. A few tons of supplies could mean the difference between holding a position and abandoning it. A single aircraft could keep a unit alive. These were not dramatic revelations. They were practical ones, learned slowly, under rain, with tired hands and wet boots. Today, when people speak of forgotten wars, they often mean wars that did not produce a clear symbol or a simple story. Burma produced neither. It produced a network, a system of air routes, roads, rivers, and human effort that stretched across a continent. A demonstration that in places where the land itself resists movement, the act of moving becomes the central struggle. The men and women who fought there rarely described themselves as part of something grand. They described themselves as part of a line of trucks on a road that used to be a trail, a line of planes waiting to take off into cloud, a line of people passing crates from one set of hands to another. And when the line held, the war moved forward. When it broke, everything else stopped. That, more than any single battle, was the shape of the war in Burma, not a moment, a motion. If you strip away the maps and the plans, what remains in Burma is the body, not the idea of a soldier, the actual one, sweating, shaking, coughing, bleeding, and trying, day after day, to stay upright in a place that seemed designed to wear people down one system at a time. In most wars, wounds arrive loudly. In Burma, many arrived quietly. Life in Burma was shaped by heat, rain, and long distances. Moving through the region required constant effort, planning, and cooperation in a landscape that offered few easy paths. Support teams learned that help often had to be provided close to where people were, because traveling to larger centers could take days and was not always possible. Temporary shelters were built from simple materials like bamboo and canvas. People rested close together on damp ground while staff worked long hours, cleaning tools over small fires and using whatever supplies arrived. Official reports emphasized routine and prevention. Nets, clean water practices, and regular schedules became part of daily life. These efforts supported many. They could not reach everyone. Letters home often focused on scenery, weather, and small moments of kindness, leaving the hardest experiences unspoken. One person wrote in 1944 that many go back to camp and do not return to the road without further explanation. Behind the scenes, many never took part in direct action, yet their work kept everything moving. Drivers spent days on narrow mountain roads, often without barriers and with steep drops beside them. During the monsoon, landslides could remove entire sections overnight. Vehicles sank into deep mud, and unloading by hand was sometimes the only way forward. Engineers became, in effect, permanent residents of the front. They rebuilt bridges that had been bombed, flooded, or simply washed away. They laid down steel mesh to turn swamps into something a vehicle could cross. They cut through forest with chainsaws and explosives, reshaping the land into a temporary version of itself. One American engineer wrote in his diary that he spent more time fighting water than thinking about the enemy. In the air, the burden was different, but no lighter. Transport crews flew into short, rough airstrips carved out of jungle clearings. There were no towers, no radar, often no proper weather reports. Pilots judged wind by watching trees bend. They judged runway length by memory and faith. Parachute drops missed their targets. Crates smashed open on impact. Sometimes, food landed in ravines or rivers and was simply lost. On the ground, soldiers watched the sky, hoping the next plane would be more accurate. There are accounts of units surviving on half rations for weeks, waiting for a drop that never came, Local civilians became part of the system, whether they wanted to or not. In some areas, villagers were hired as porters, carrying supplies on their backs along narrow paths that vehicles could not use. In others, food was purchased or requisitioned. Markets appeared near bases, selling rice, vegetables, and sometimes meat to soldiers who had not seen fresh food in months. These interactions were not always peaceful. There were misunderstandings, shortages, and moments of violence. The war passed through communities that had little say in its direction but felt every consequence. Burmese nurses and medical assistants worked alongside Allied doctors in some hospitals, translating, caring for the wounded, and navigating cultural gaps that could be as challenging as the physical terrain. Their names rarely appear in official histories. In 1944, when the front moved north and east, some villages found themselves caught between shifting lines of control. Families fled into the hills, carrying what they could. Others stayed, adapting to whichever uniform appeared that week. For them, the war was not Allied or Japanese. It was simply present. There are stories collected by post-war researchers of children who learned to identify aircraft by sound, not for curiosity, but for safety. A low, steady drone meant transport. A higher, faster sound meant fighters or bombers. Each meant something different for where to hide. In the midst of this, there were moments that felt almost out of place. A Christmas service held under a tarp, with candles stuck in empty bottles. A football match played on a patch of flattened ground near an airstrip. A letter from home that took months to arrive, folded and unfolded until the paper went soft at the edges. These small rituals did not change the war. They changed the day. In official casualty figures, the Burma campaign is often summarized in numbers. Tens of thousands killed. Many more wounded or sick. Divisions reduced to fractions of their strength and then rebuilt. But the numbers do not show the long-term effects. Veterans returned with chronic illnesses. Malaria relapses could strike years later. Feet damaged by constant exposure to water never fully recovered. Some carried scars that were visible. Others carried memories that were not. In interviews recorded decades after the war, some soldiers said they found it difficult to explain Burma to people who had not been there. The war they remembered did not fit into neat stories of battles won or lost. They remembered a place where the environment felt like another side in the conflict. The jungle that hid enemy movement. The rivers that delayed advances. The weather that decided when operations could happen at all. In this sense, the Burma campaign was not just a clash between armies. It was a negotiation with the landscape. And the landscape always took its share. By the time the war ended, many of the medical and logistical systems built in Burma were studied by militaries around the world. Air supply to surrounded units, jungle medicine, rapid road construction under combat conditions. These became lessons written into manuals and training programs. But the people who had lived those lessons did not experience them as doctrine. They experienced them as mornings where getting out of a wet blanket was the first victory of the day. As nights where the sound of rain on canvas meant another long, cold wait for dawn. As afternoons where a plane appearing in the sky meant that someone, somewhere, had remembered them. When the war in Burma ended, it did not leave behind a clean silence. It left behind roads that led somewhere new, airstrips that cut across fields that had once grown rice, towns that had been rebuilt in a hurry, using whatever materials could be found, and people who had spent years adjusting to the presence of armies now trying to remember what an ordinary day felt like. For many Allied soldiers, the journey home took almost as long as the journey into Burma had. Ships were scarce. Units were reassigned. Some men were sent on to other parts of Asia as the war against Japan continued. Others waited in camps, surrounded by jungle that no longer held an enemy, but still held the same heat and insects and rain. In letters written in late 1945, there is often a strange mix of relief and restlessness. The war was over, but the rhythm of it had shaped how people moved, ate, and slept. Peace felt unfamiliar. Back in Britain, India, Africa, China, and the United States, Burma rarely made the front pages. The world's attention turned to Europe's ruins and to the atomic ending of the war in Japan. The jungle campaign faded into the background. Part of this was timing. The final months in Burma overlapped with events that reshaped global politics in more dramatic ways. Germany's surrender, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the creation of the United Nations. Compared to these, the retaking of Rangoon did not feel like a turning point for the world. Part of it was geography. Burma was far from the centers of media and publishing that shaped popular history in the decades that followed. Many memoirs and studies were written, but they circulated within military and academic circles rather than in mass culture. And part of it was the nature of the campaign itself. There was no single, defining moment that could be easily remembered. No day that could be labeled as the day the war in Burma was won. It was a sequence of advances, pauses, and connections being made and remade over years. Historians like David Rooney have described the campaign as one of the greatest logistical achievements of the war, precisely because it took place in a region that seemed to resist logistics at every turn. Yet logistics does not photograph well. A convoy of trucks on a muddy road does not carry the same immediate symbolism as a flag raised over a city. A crate of medical supplies does not look like a victory, even if it keeps 100 people alive. In academic studies, the Burma campaign is often used as a case study in multinational warfare. British, Indian, African, Chinese, American, and Burmese forces operated under overlapping commands with different languages, traditions, and priorities. Coordination was a constant challenge. Orders had to be translated. Training standards had to be aligned. Equipment had to be made compatible. Even something as simple as radio frequencies became a point of negotiation. But this complexity also meant that the campaign built connections that lasted beyond the war. Chinese and American cooperation in northern Burma laid groundwork for post-war relationships, even as politics later shifted dramatically. Indian soldiers who had fought across Burma returned to a country on the brink of independence, carrying experiences that would shape how they saw their place in the world. For Burma itself, the war accelerated change. The Japanese occupation and the Allied return disrupted the structures of British colonial rule. Nationalist groups gained momentum. Political leaders who had operated in the shadows stepped into public life. In 1948, Burma became independent. The country that emerged carried the imprint of the war in its infrastructure, its political divisions, and its memory. Some of the roads built for military use became trade routes. Others fell into disrepair, reclaimed by forest. Airfields became civilian airports or disappeared under grass and trees. The physical traces of the campaign blended back into the landscape. Memory did not. In small towns across Britain and India, regimental associations kept the story alive. Annual dinners, newsletters, memorial plaques in churches and community halls. Lists of names carved into stone. In China, the memory of the hump pilots and the reopening of the land route into Yunnan became part of a broader narrative of endurance during years of invasion. In Myanmar, the war is remembered alongside the struggle for independence, sometimes as a background to a much longer story of conflict and identity. In recent decades, historians and filmmakers have returned to Burma with new questions. How did ordinary soldiers experience a war that was defined by movement rather than front lines? How did local communities navigate years of shifting control? What does it mean for a campaign to be strategically important but culturally invisible? Works like Forgotten Armies by Bailey and Harper and Burma, The Longest War by Louise Allen, have helped bring the campaign back into scholarly and public discussion. Archives have been opened. Oral history projects have recorded voices that might otherwise have been lost. These efforts do not turn Burma into a spectacle. They turn it into a record of people working within systems that were larger than any one decision, of lives shaped by roads and rivers, by aircraft and medicine, by the simple ability to move something from one place to another. In this way, the war in Burma offers a different way to think about conflict. Not as a series of dramatic confrontations, but as a continuous process of connection. A reminder that what decides outcomes is often not who advances the fastest, but who can sustain the longest. For the men and women who lived it, that idea was not a theory. It was a daily reality. The next meal depended on a truck making it through a flooded pass. The next operation depended on an airstrip staying dry. The next day depended on a fever breaking. When those things happened, the war moved forward. When they did not, everything else paused. This is why Burma remains, for many, a forgotten war. Not because it lacked importance, but because its story is written in systems rather than scenes, in lines of supply rather than lines of troops, in quiet persistence rather than loud conclusions. And for those who walked its roads, flew its skies, and lay under its reign, that persistence was the war. In the years after the war, the documents began to settle into archives. Maps were folded and filed. Operation orders were boxed and labeled. Flight logs from the hump were stacked in quiet rooms where the sound of turning pages replaced the sound of engines. The story of Burma became something you could look up. U.S. Army Air Forces reports recorded the tonnage flown into China month by month. British 14th Army War Diaries listed movements, casualties, and weather conditions with careful precision. Chinese nationalist records described the reopening of land routes as a strategic lifeline restored. Each source told the same story in a different language. Numbers, coordinates, timelines. What they could not fully record was how it felt to live inside those systems. Historians reconstruct the campaign by tracing connections. They follow how a decision in a headquarters in Delhi or Chungking led to an airfield being built in a jungle clearing. How that airfield allowed a supply drop. How that supply drop allowed a unit to hold a hill. How that hill shaped a movement on a map weeks later. This is how the war in Burma reveals itself, not as a sequence of battles, but as a chain. A chain that runs from a factory in the United States or India, where a crate is packed, to a port, where it is loaded onto a ship, to an airfield, where it is transferred to a plane, to a clearing in the jungle, where it falls by parachute, to a pair of hands that open it and pass its contents to someone who needs it. Break any link, and the whole motion slows. This way of looking at war has shaped how modern militaries think. Concepts like logistics dominance and sustainment trace part of their lineage to places like Burma, where movement itself was the main challenge. But for the people who lived there, the lesson was simpler. Distance matters, weather matters, health matters, and none of them can be ignored for long. In recent years, travelers and researchers have followed the old routes. Sections of the Ledo Road can still be found, cracked and overgrown, winding through hills that have returned to quiet. Remnants of airstrips appear as flat scars in fields. Bridges built by wartime engineers still carry civilian traffic in some areas, their origins unmarked by plaques or signs. The jungle has softened the edges, but it has not erased everything. In small museums and local memorials, photographs show young faces in uniforms that look too large for them. Captions list names, units, and dates. Sometimes there is only a name. In oral history recordings, elderly veterans describe the same moments in different accents. The first time they saw the Himalayas from the cockpit of a transport plane. The sound of rain on a helmet that never seemed to stop. The taste of fresh fruit after months of rations. These are not strategic insights. They are human ones. The war in Burma did not leave behind a single, shared image for the world to remember. It left behind thousands of personal ones, scattered across families, countries, and decades. That scattering is part of why the campaign fades in and out of public memory. It belongs to many histories at once. To British military history, to the story of Indian soldiers fighting far from home, to China's long war of resistance, to Myanmar's path toward independence, to American aviation and the early age of global airlift. No single narrative can fully hold it. And so it often sits at the edge of others, referenced, summarized, moved past. Yet its influence remains in quiet, practical ways. Every modern operation that relies on air supply to isolated units echoes in fall and make Tila. Every humanitarian airlift into disaster zones follows routes first tested by hump pilots. Every discussion about sustaining forces in difficult terrain returns, in some form, to the problems faced in Burma. The Jungle Campaign became a template, even if its name is not always spoken. For those who stood in it, the memory is less abstract. It is the memory of mud on hands and boots, of a plain silhouette against cloud, of a road that did not exist yesterday and does today. It is the memory of being part of something that moved slowly, because many people kept it moving. When you look back at the war in Burma from a distance, it can feel like a story about systems, supply lines, air routes, infrastructure, coordination. But when you listen closely, beneath those systems, there is a quieter rhythm. Footsteps on wet ground, engines starting in the dark, voices calling out names in a crowded medical tent. That rhythm is the part that does not always make it into books. It is the part that belongs to the people who were there. And perhaps that is what makes this a forgotten war. Not that it lacks records, not that it lacks importance, but that its meaning lies less in moments you can point to, and more in emotion you can only follow. Emotion that crossed jungles, mountains, and rivers. Emotion that carried food, medicine, fuel, and people through a place that resisted all of it. Emotion that, in the end, did not look like victory. It looked like connection. And when the last connections were made, and the last lines were closed, the war in Burma ended the same way it had been fought, not with a single, loud moment, but with the slow, steady quiet of movement finally coming to rest.